Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Aaron Rosenblum. I am the Health and Science Librarian at the Portland Public Library, and I'm happy to be your Zoom host this evening. If we were in person, I would be your host in the Rhines Auditorium at the Main Library on Monument Square, and we hope to be there again one day soon. You can see, what am I called? I'm called Portland Public Library. If you have any issues with the Zoom or any questions about the technology or anything, feel free to send a message through the chat to me and I can try to help you out. Tonight's program is part of the 6th year of our sustainability series, which we co-host with our partners at the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. Before we go any further and get into tonight's program, I would like to offer PPL's land acknowledgement. So acknowledgement is a simple way of showing respect and a step toward correcting the stories and practices that have erased Indigenous peoples' history and culture, and towards inviting and honoring the truth. Portland Public Library would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the occupied and unceded territory of the Wabanaki, the people of the place where the sun first looks our way, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all the Native communities who have lived in Chewabunkeag for over 3,000 generations in what we now call New England and the Canadian Maritimes. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. So with that, I'll also let you know just briefly that we'll have a discussion and a Q&A after the presentation, but you can feel free during the presentation to drop your questions in the chat or using the Q&A function that you'll also see along with the chat on your screen. Do that anytime throughout, and we'll kind of collate the questions and we will ask them of our guest when we get to the end of the program, and hopefully we'll have time for all of the questions. So now I would like to pass it over to Jess Burton, the Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Holly, for being here. I'm Jess Burton. I'm the Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, and the SMCC, we call ourselves SMCC. We work collectively in Maine to create mutually beneficial relationships with the earth, communities, and people through the conservation movement. And our partnership with the Portland Public Schools at Portland Public Library has been something that has been one of the highlights of my job and our work over the last 5 years. We've worked to really advance and share this space with so many people and as a platform for many different topics. You can find a lot of them, the videos of them, on either of our websites, the Portland Public Library, and on our website, the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. So I invite you to spend some time visiting those, and then stay tuned for our exciting lineup in 2022. But tonight we are super excited to welcome Holly Parker. Holly, I've known Holly for a number of years, and she is just super and dynamic, and she is joining us today as the director of UNE North, the Institute for North Atlantic Studies at the University of New England. As an educator for more than 20 years, Holly has worked in traditional, experiential, and digital classroom settings. She has collaborated with school systems in Alaska and the US Virgin Islands to develop standards-aligned interdisciplinary digital curricula, taught high school English for 14 years in boarding school settings, and directed a boat building program for at-risk youth in Maine. And so in that educator role, I am super excited to hear about Holly's experience at what she's going to talk about at COP26. Yeah, so welcome, Holly. Take it away.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Aaron, and thanks both the Portland Public Library and the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative for inviting me to speak about my adventures at COP. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So Again, thank you for having me here this evening. When I was at COP in late October and early November, I actually had this presentation on my schedule for November 8th and only realized my mistake a couple of days before that. And I was very relieved because I needed at least a month to process my experience at COP26, what I saw there, what I heard there, and understand how the experience has changed my perspective on this remarkable and somewhat messy event. So I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts, but I'm also looking forward to hearing from you. I'm happy to answer any questions about COP or my work here at UNE and UNE North, but I'm also interested in hearing from you about your ideas about how Maine and Mainers can take the lead in climate action. So first, why was I at COP? Who am I and what brought me to this remarkable place? So first and foremost, I am the director of UNE North, the Institute for North Atlantic Studies, the University of New England. And in that work, I look to build sustainable solutions for challenges facing us here in Maine and throughout the North Atlantic. This work has taken me to some of the most climate vulnerable places in the world, particularly in the North and in the Arctic. And seeing that impact has really influenced the urgency I feel to take action both personally and professionally for climate change and climate change action. So that picture on the lower left-hand corner is me on a remarkable trip to Iceland a couple of years ago. That is Dettifoss, the second most powerful waterfall in Europe. And it was a really life-changing experience to go to the northern part of Iceland. In the upper left-hand corner, a little goofy selfie, but it's an important one, that I'm also a very avid squash player and a member of Portland Community Squash here in Portland. And I brought my Portland Community Squash hat with me to COP so I could snap this picture and show the kids that UNE North has been working with at Portland Community Squash, that Portland Community Squash was on the ground at COP26. And I want to share a little bit about that project work later on in my presentation. I'm also a very proud aunt. My niece would shoot me for sharing this photo as she's now a freshman in college at UVM, go Catamounts. But when I see this photo and I think of the future, I think of a world and a place in which I hope she can thrive. And so again, as someone with an eye towards the future, I really think about it in terms of people. I'm also a sailor. And so this is a picture from my schooner bum days when I was sailing out here in Casco Bay. And my connection to my work is really driven through a sense of place and a sense of belonging here in Maine. And as a sailor, I see climate impacts very clearly in the Gulf. And so for me, that is also a piece of the why am I at COP puzzle. And then finally, I love puffins. Puffins are a creature that we share with environments throughout the North Atlantic. And I really hope that in my work, as challenging as it can be, that I bring this kind of hopeful joy that I feel like this puffin represents to my work at UNE North. So a little bit about UNE North. It is the Institute for North Atlantic Studies at the University of New England. It was founded in 2018, and its goal is to connect researchers, educators, policymakers, and industry leaders from across Maine and the North Atlantic to implement collaborative approaches to building resilient communities, thriving economies, and healthy environments. We're grounded in our work in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which began to be developed in the late 1990s to combat poverty and have now been included to impact poverty, inequities, and climate change. We use this globally recognized framework at UNE North to plan our work, to implement our work, and to evaluate our work. And we're also committed through education and outreach to make our UNE community, as well as all Mainers, more aware of this framework and how it has potential to elevate Maine's role in sustainable development, really to a global level. When we go abroad and present and speak at conferences, this framework is the language we speak with each other. And so Maine has a real opportunity to use this framework to position itself on a global stage. So I learned lessons about COP before I even got there, and it was quite the process to become an observer. University of New England is the only institution or organization in the state of Maine that does have UN observer status for the climate conferences. We did get that this year, and it was a really epic process. It is not easy. We started the process last December. It took us about a month to complete the process. A lot of institutional support, a lot of working across different departments of the university to gather the documents necessary. and then submit it, and then wait 9 months to see if we had been accepted as observers. We were also waiting to see if COP would be held in person due to the pandemic. So we didn't find out really until August that not only was COP happening, but that we would have the ability to be there as observers. So having cleared that hurdle, unexpected travel adventures arose that I really think were due in somewhat to COP itself. So the night before I traveled, my accommodations were canceled. Unceremoniously, my reservation was no longer honored. I got that news at about 5:30 at night and had planned to take about a 9 o'clock shuttle to Logan the next day. Wasn't exactly comfortable with the idea of going to Scotland without any accommodations. In the previous months, since COP was announced to be in person, the prices for accommodations in Glasgow and even in Edinburgh had skyrocketed. And so my reservation, which had been made 6 months in advance, hoping that we would be going, was actually canceled in favor of someone who would pay a higher rate. So it took about 7 hours for Expedia to call me at 2:30 in the morning to tell me they had found a room for me in Glasgow, which would honor my original rate. I said yes, got on the plane, and I went, and I spent 6 days, 6 nights trying pretty much not to touch anything in the room or the accommodation where I was staying. So that adventure cleared, some questions really started to come up, which are, what are the barriers to even entering the conversation? If I did not have a university behind me, if I did not have the institutional support that UNE offered, how would I have become an observer in the first place? And what degree of privilege does one need to be in the room? What degree of financial support? I had to pay for it. We had to pay for airfare. I had to be the person who was calling Expedia in the middle of the night, demanding that they find me a hotel room. So there are real barriers to even getting to the COP itself. So why Glasgow? Why was Glasgow chosen to be the home for COP? And there's a great historical reference to this in Vicki Allen's story in the Herald that came out November 6th, which I'd love to share with you. Quote, it's 1765. James Watt is wandering Glasgow Green, pondering the inefficiencies of the early steam engine, when he comes up with the idea of a separate condensing chamber. With a eureka moment, something is unleashed and a chain of events and inventions unfolds that will lead us to railways, steamships, the internal combustion engine, and a few centuries of frenetic burning of fossil fuels. All of it gushing out carbon dioxide. All of it bringing us to the climate crisis we face now. All of it taking us to a point where in 2021, Glasgow is host to a major climate conference, and that same Glasgow Green, walked by Watt, is the site of mass protest. So you could feel this historical relevance when I was in Glasgow for COP. It is an incredibly industrial city. It has clearly thrived in that role. And now it is being asked to pivot to play this new role as a climate actor. So what is COP? COP is officially known as the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The UN does love its long-winded titles. The conference, the ultimate objective of the convention is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions to, quote, a level at which that would prevent dangerous human-induced interference with the climate system. It states that such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So the UNFCCC entered into force in 1994 after the Rio Convention in 1992, and 197 countries are signatories. This year's COP, despite the pandemic, attracted 25,000 delegates from 200 countries, including governments, NGOs, corporate representatives, and advocacy groups. It truly was a remarkable gathering, and the COVID precautions were tremendous. Just everyone had to test every day in their hotels, send the results to the National Health Service. They would send you a text message that would allow you to get into the venue. Obviously, there is some trust-based personal trust placed in that system, that people are going to report if they test positive, but I have not heard of any COVID cases related to COP26. This was the first meeting since the Paris Agreement in 2015 to expect enhanced commitments to climate change mitigation, so increased emissions reductions. So every year the climate conference meets, but every 5 years or 4 years, there are reports out from heads of state on achievements towards the goals and then recommitments to new goals. So to put this in context of the Paris Accord, which was the last large agreement signed in Paris in 2015, there are 3 pillars of the Paris Accord. There's mitigation, finance, and adaptation. And so mitigation refers to the technologies, strategies, and partnerships to reduce carbon emissions. This also includes technologies for renewable energy and technologies to move us away from petroleum and other damaging extractive products. For example, it could include technology alternatives to palm oil, which would reduce deforestation and preserve carbon sinks. Adaptation, which is symbolized on the right, refers to addressing in real time the impact of climate change. This is very important to developing nations and indigenous peoples who are disproportionately feeling the impact of climate change, despite the fact that they are responsible for a less than 1% of carbon emissions. And they're seeing that change in the form of sea level rise, storm activity, drought, temperature rise, and temperature changes. And so adaptation really is how are they going to adapt to the changes they're experiencing in real time. And then finance refers to who's paying for mitigation and adaptation, and how are those funds being collected and how are they being distributed to those in need. This was a huge topic of conversation at COP26 because the Paris commitments, particularly to adaptation funding, had not been met. Again, disproportionately impacting those already disproportionately impacted. Not only were funds not realized, but the systems that were used to distribute the fund to communities were being criticized as being slow and ineffective. So the money was not being committed, and what money there was not getting to the people in need. It's interesting that the mitigation funds of Paris had been fully funded, but many of those funds are going to developed nations who are developing advanced technologies to reduce emissions, whereas there's a real need in developing countries for funds to address the impacts of climate change now. So one of the key things that I wanted to talk about tonight was my observations about who has voice and who has authority in events like the COP. And so I took several pictures and I'll just walk you through some of this. And then I want to end with a statement from Daly Sambadura of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So as you heard, there were many protests in Glasgow. I did leave before the youth protests with Greta Thunberg, but the protests were constant. There were constantly people moving from the Glasgow Green to the COP venue. And I walked past this particular gathering on my way home one evening, and I was shocked because the banner says, "How many cops to arrest climate chaos?" And I saw that, and I saw the cops, and I thought, my God, they're protesting with us. This is great. All of these cops, there were more than 10,000 security personnel at the COP between police officers and UN security, and then private and then government securities. So I thought, this is wonderful. The cops are marching. It was a phalanx of cops coming down the road. When in actuality, they were surrounding a very small group of protesters. And so this picture that I snapped thinking, wow, this is great. The police are with us. It wasn't they were against us, but they were not with us in this case. And they had completely, almost consumed this group of protesters as they moved through the streets of Glasgow. Children had a voice in ways at COP. The lower left-hand corner is a picture of a display, an exhibit I saw of writings from children who had been invited to write to the UN with their feelings about climate. This was a comment from a young person in Yemen. In the center photo at the top, this young woman was at a hotel that actually was in the blue zone. And as everyone was crowded in trying to get through security, she stood there. Her arms must have been falling off. She stood there for 10 minutes holding this sign that says, "Save the planet." The bottom center picture is really interesting. This was a picture of an ecumenical march that came to Glasgow and arrived the Saturday before the COP. And this was a group of folks who had walked from London to Glasgow. They had been met in London by folks from all over Europe who had walked to France and then made their way over the channel into London. So there were people from Poland, there were people from Austria. It was an incredible gathering of folks that had come to make their voices heard in a peaceful protest. And they were then again at COP all week. The bottom right-hand photo is of some of the amazing street art and art that we saw in Glasgow that was reflecting the need for planetary health and climate action. What was remarkable was almost every gallery, every museum was dedicated to work that had this message of climate action. And it was very loud and clear, and some of it was very, very beautiful. And finally, in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of my colleague, Daly Sambadura. Daly is the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. She is a world-renowned activist and advocate for her people in the Arctic. And Daly was there speaking in one of the small pavilions. And it was so good to see her and find some people that I knew. It was so overwhelming. And she was speaking about the role that the Inuit play in informing shipping that is going through the Arctic and making sure that it is safe as possible, and the impacts that it has on the people of the Arctic. What was shocking to me was Daly was wearing a badge, a temporary presenter badge, which meant she didn't have observer status that day. And I had observer status, and I could not, that was hard for me to reconcile in that moment, that I was there with this kind of official recognition of myself as a delegate in my institution. And for some reason, Daly was there on a temporary pass. And this is someone who is a very important voice in the world. And so I do want to read a statement from Daly that the ICC released, the Inuit Circumpolar Council released ahead of the COP, and talk about kind of just because the authority and the energy and the vision behind the statement, I think, is incredibly powerful. Quote, "Our requests go above and beyond the remit of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Inuit, like many Indigenous peoples, view the world in a holistic fashion. We cannot break it down into issues of climate, ocean governance, human rights, or food security. For us, all these issues are bound together, and we challenge the states that are parties to this convention and to the many other relevant conventions of the United Nations to view the world in the same way, to make the connections necessary between all the different conventions to tackle issues holistically. Inuit leaders, elders, knowledge holders, and youth will be attending COP26 and as many other COPs and interim meetings as we can to continue to raise awareness of the situation in our homelands, the violation of interrelated human rights, and the existential threats facing our communities and culture. The global community must act now to work with us in responding to this threat and do all that it can to curb climate change. We cannot wait any longer." So I'd like to share with you a video that I also shared with my Portland Community Squash students when I came home. This is the speaker, the climate activist Elizabeth Watuti. She's from Kenya, and she was one of the several youth speakers that were invited to speak at the opening ceremonies for COP. And when you hear her speak, I think you'll know why I'm sharing this particular video.
And environmental activist Elizabeth Watuti.
My name is Elizabeth Watuti. I am a youth climate activist from Kenya. I have done a lot of soul searching about what to say here today. I have asked myself over and over what words might move you. And then I realized that making my 4 minutes count does not rest solely on me. My truth will only land if you have the grace to fully listen. My story will only move you if you can open up your heart. I can urge you to act at the pace and scale necessary, but in the end, your will to act must come from deep within. I need to tell you what is happening in my home country. Right now, as we sit comfortably here in this conference center in Glasgow, over 2 million of my fellow Kenyans are facing climate-related starvation. In this past year, both of our rainy seasons have failed, and scientists say that it may be another 12 months before the waters return again. Meanwhile, our rivers are running dry, our harvests are failing, our storehouses stand empty, our animals and people are dying. I have seen with my own eyes 3 young children crying at the side of a dried up river after walking 12 miles with their mother to find water. Please open your hearts. This is not only happening in Kenya. Over the past few months, there have been deadly heat waves and wildfires in Algeria and devastating floods in Uganda and Nigeria. And there is more still to come. By 2025, in just 4 years' time, half of the world's population will be facing water scarcity. And by the time I'm 50, the climate crisis will have displaced 86 million people in sub-Saharan Africa alone. I would like you to join me in holding a moment of compassionate silence for the billions of people who are not here with us today, whose stories are not being heard, and whose suffering is not being felt. Please open your hearts. If you allow yourself to feel it, the heartbreak and the injustice is hard to bear. Sub-Saharan Africans are responsible for just 0.5% of historical emissions. The children are responsible for none, but they are bearing the brunt. We are the adults on this earth right now, and it is our responsibility to ensure that the children have food and water. I have been doing what I can. Inspired by the great Professor Wangari Maathai, I founded the Green Generation Initiative, a tree growing initiative that enhances food security for young Kenyans. So far, we have grown 30,000 fruit trees to maturity, providing desperately needed nutrition for thousands of children. Every day we see that when we look after the trees, they look after us. But these trees and the life-saving fruit they bear will not survive on a 2.7 degrees Celsius warmer planet. The decisions you make here will help determine whether the rains will return to our land. The decisions you make here will help determine whether the fruit trees we plant will live or perish. The decisions you make here will help determine whether children will have food and water. I believe in our human capacity to care deeply and to act collectively. I believe in our ability to do what is right if we let ourselves feel it in our hearts. So for these next 2 weeks, let us feel it in our hearts. The children cannot live on words and empty promises. They are waiting for you to act. Please open your hearts and then act. Thank you.
And environmental act.
So you can really tell why I would choose that video. She was remarkable and really set a tone for the 2 weeks of the Glasgow conference. So at the end of the 2 weeks, the Glasgow Pact was released, and there were some successes and failures to that. And I would love to share my thoughts on that with you. So the Glasgow Pact, some of the successes that have been cited were that the United States and China actually agreed to work together on climate change, despite rifts in their diplomatic relationship. We've seen those rifts this week, actually, surrounding the Olympics. But there has been a verbal commitment between the two largest emitters to do this work together. On the topic of deforestation, more than 130 nations possessing 90% of the world's forests committed to halting and then reversing deforestation by 2030. There are still some major challenges to this, particularly in Indonesia, which immediately began questioning this language after COP. Methane, which is really fuels up to 80 times more heating over a 20-year period than carbon dioxide. Over 100 nations pledged to cut 30% of their emissions of this greenhouse gas by 2030. And then on the side of financial commitments, over 450 financial institutions that oversee $130 trillion in assets have promised to align their portfolios with the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Coal was both a success and failure at COP26. For the first time, there was language about coal, which is the single biggest source of global temperature rise. The language was the phase down of unabated coal power, and that was included in the Glasgow Pact. However, the coal was also the subject of failure, with some coal-reliant countries have indicated they will not completely stop until 2040s or later. And also coal was the pivot issue that that threatened the actual pact itself. In the 11th hour, India and China refused to commit to language stronger than to draw down and phase down, and threaten the entire viability of the pact itself. Finance was also a problem. The UN Environment Program has estimated that developing countries are going to need significant funds in order every year for adaptation, but that the numbers are simply not adding up. The Adaptation Fund did receive $356 million in new support at COP26, but again, we've yet to meet the expectations and commitments that were made at Paris for that very same fund. And even at that level, those numbers are inadequate. Wealthier nations also blocked a proposal for a loss and damage fund, which would be in addition to the Adaptation Fund to address the immediate socioeconomic impacts of climate change. And that was a real blow to the bloc of developing nations that proposed that fund. And I'll tell you why. So the reason a loss and damage fund is so crucial is exemplified by September 6, 2017 and Hurricane Irma, the night that Barbuda died. The country of Antigua Barbuda was slammed by Hurricane Irma, and in just 36 hours, 90% of the buildings were severely damaged in Barbuda, and which resulted in the evacuation of almost all of its people to neighboring Antigua. The losses were massive, and with a country with a GDP of only 1.4 billion, it was simply unable to recover on its own steam and its own funding. And so having a loss and damage fund that would be supported by the developed nations for developing nations would allow them to recover from catastrophes like Hurricane Irma. Unfortunately, that was not included in the pact. And as I mentioned, the last minute negotiations by China and India, which threatened the entire Glasgow agreement, was a source of real anger and sadness on the part of the COP participants. In presenting the final climate pact at this final session of the COP, President Alok Sharma was visibly emotional when he said, "May I just say to all delegates, I apologize for the way this process has unfolded, and I'm deeply sorry. I also understand the deep disappointment, but I think, as you have noted, it's also vital that we protect this package." And so that disproportionate voice of two nations, even one nation, to throw the entire pact off track really gave a degree of power to those nations that was deeply felt and was deeply disappointing. So in closing, I want to bring you back to that article by Vicki Allen in the Herald. And she concluded that article about Glasgow and hosting COP by saying, "We took our carbon loan out early. We made our dear carbon place. And this is one way of paying it back." So Glasgow was disrupted to an epic level during COP. And there were many, many complaints from local Glaswegians about the disruption to their lives. But really this idea of purpose and this idea of an obligation came through loud and clear. Three thoughts that I came away with is really that it's imperative that those with privilege lift up and give space to those who are most impacted by climate change, the indigenous peoples and the developing nations. Those voices hold tremendous cultural knowledge about the challenge and potential solutions. Also, the transitions from fossil fuels must be just and equitable. We can't simply throw a switch on developing nations and force them to comply with things that will not allow them to develop their nations. So we have to find that middle ground. We have to understand how to do this in a just and equitable manner. And a question is, are the systems that we have in place suited to the transformation we need to combat climate change? Is the COP capable of actually transforming itself? I look at how it tried to give voice to traditionally voices that were on the edge, to youth, to women, to the indigenous peoples. And the construction of Indigenous Day or Gender Day really siloed those groups at COP as opposed to putting them at the table for all conversations and in all meetings. So coming home, I told you I'd come back to Portland Community Squash. Coming home was tough. I came home after the first week and I was completely overwhelmed by my experience. And I want to explain that goofy selfie I took. So I was feeling pretty small and wondering if what I do here at UNE North or even in my own life could really have an impact on such an enormous challenge. I was also simultaneously inspired by those youth voices that we heard from the stage and then I saw in the streets. But I was definitely in the post-COP funk. So the week after I came back, I returned to Portland Community Squash, where UNE North is working on an art and sustainability project. We've spent time with the kids all semester, every Thursday, with their after-school, middle school program. And we've introduced them through video and arts to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we asked them to create murals of their visions for a more sustainable Portland. Through art, they found this incredible voice. And so on this Thursday visit after COP, I showed them the video that I shared with you. And these are middle schoolers and they were riveted. You could hear a pin drop in the room as they listened to Elizabeth Watuti. And they asked me dozens of questions. What can we do? How can we do it? Who can we talk to? Their energy and their hope and their creativity just made me realize that the work I do at UNE North is important. And maybe in that group is the next Elizabeth Watuti. So we can all find ways, I think, to have an impact in this battle for our future. And I thank the kids at Portland Community Squash for reminding me of that. So with that, I'm going to conclude my talking bit. It's a little strange to talk to a screen and not be able to see all of you, but I hope that you'll put some questions or discussion points in the chat and we can continue on. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to Jess and Aaron.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was really great. Your presentation was so accessible and you included so many details that made me feel like I was kind of there with you. So I appreciate it. And I recognize that it was so huge. just
Yes.
like trying to capture all of that. Like what a challenge. So
Mhm.
I just want to thank you for that great presentation.
Thank you.
And we do have one question so far, and we're inviting more, of course. And this is from my friend Helen. Can you speak to any areas of progress since the Paris Accord? Put another way, are there any successes or positive deviants that can be built upon? I'm looking for threads of hope. Thanks, Helen, for that question.
So yes, Helen. So I would say that there have been some real great points. I would actually point to earlier, I mentioned that the mitigation funding had been fully funded, and as opposed to the adaptation funding. And while I do see that as a little bit questionable, as most of those technologies are being developed in developed nations, so they are receiving funding to create those mitigation strategies and technologies, they are being developed. And so we're seeing a great leap forward in climate technology. And particularly what's really interesting to me is looking at the natural world and how we can work with the natural world to repair itself. And so it's not just about building wind turbines, but it's about examining, for instance, how the oceans can be successfully leveraged as carbon sinks without impacting the oceans negatively. Actually, the Aspen Institute just released a report on that idea today. So there is a lot of activity, particularly on the mitigation side, and a lot of money flowing into it. And that's good. That's really good. I would say that seeing, for me, the thing that gave me hope was seeing these negotiation teams working around the clock. They had worked obviously coming into the COP, but they were relentless. And the amount, I've never seen wheeling and dealing done in such a way where in, corners of hallways, you look over and you're like, there's Secretary Kerry wheeling and dealing with someone, he's right there. He's pretty hard to miss. So it's really remarkable to see that. I would also say that, we hold up Greta Thunberg as the hero that she is, but she has changed the dynamic of this work tremendously in activating youth voices and centralizing attention on it. She's not the only voice for sure. And I didn't show her in this. I wanted to kind of focus on Elizabeth because suddenly they're on the stage. They had to listen. And I give Greta Thunberg credit for lifting up those voices and kind of putting them at the fore. So I do see that, I do see hope there. And certainly, we're hearing the urgency more and more, and we're hearing it from the countries that need to do the work. And so that I have hope for. But again, many of these countries have political systems like ours where the pendulum can swing one way or another, and what is a priority and what is not a priority at the federal level can be tough. So that's why I think Maine has such potential power to be an actor in this climate stage. So I hope that answers your question, Helen, and gives you some hope.
So we have another hope question, and it really leads right out of the end of your answer, which is, where do you see hope in Maine specifically?
Yeah. So hope in Maine. I am so, what I thought was remarkable was in the middle of a pandemic, the state of Maine and the cities of Portland and South Portland managed to pull together some really amazing climate action plans. This work didn't stop because of COVID. That urgency was there. And so the Maine Won't Wait plan, as well as the One Climate Future plan in Portland and South Portland, are really incredible documents. I think the implementation of those is we don't want them to sit on a shelf. And so the hope that I see in those documents is that they are invigorating. They inspire people to take action in a way that will be measured, right? And we can measure our success. So much of sustainability work and climate work can feel a little nebulous. What is the impact? Where am I seeing the impact of my work? And so having those frameworks in which we can then measure our success, I think is really important for Maine. And I think we're having hard conversations in Maine. When I think of, for instance, the conversation about wind power in the Gulf of Maine, that is a hard conversation. We need to have the conversation in order to build social contracts for this kind of action. And so I think it's really important that we not ignore the difficult conversations, but here in Maine, we're willing to have them and to really try and find some common ground. So those are some ways that I see hope. I also love the fact that there are a lot more electric car charging stations. That's like a clear one. I love those things. They're great. And I can't wait to get a plug-in.
I feel like in Maine, we're also getting down like on a state level, which is maybe a scale where it's possible to get into some subtleties of some of the conversations. So, the CMP corridor question for some people,
Yeah.
For some people, it was just about CMP. But for some people, it was about this question, for instance, of is big hydro energy clean? And
Right.
ask Indigenous people in Canada that question. And the answer from many of them will be no. So that's a subtlety where we've gotten past just, hey, we just got to do clean energies. All right, great.
Right.
And if that's, hey, maybe we don't want wind in some places and we do want it in others, it's, subtleties that need to get answered to see this stuff happen. So that seems like a good point. It's a place the conversation needed to get to probably a long time ago, but we're getting there.
We're getting
in
there.
The conversations.
I think what's so important in this work, it's a global crisis, but the best solutions are going to be grounded with and in the people of the place, right? So the solutions are going to be very place context, like the context of place is vitally important in these conversations. And when I say place, I mean not only the place, but the cultures and systems that we've developed to live in that place. And so if we are going to talk about something that impacts fishing in the Gulf of Maine, we need to talk about it. We need to understand people's reservations, fears, and anxieties about their potential loss, and understand that and acknowledge it before we can build solutions. And I think, a lot of environmental work has been very well intentioned, but there's a tendency to charge ahead and not have those conversations and be like, we know what we want to do. It's a great thing. Who doesn't want to save a puffin? But if we don't have those conversations, we end up in some pretty rough spots in terms of implementing this work.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for lifting that conversation and that challenge, I think. And also the place, like we need to hear from the people who know the place, where the place is. So we have another question there. It's I'm going to combine two questions from the same person, and they're about coal. So the question starts with, who were the nations that pushed back most on using coal? Were they developing nations who need access to easy energy, or was it developed nations? And the second sort of part of that question is, what were their main objections to moving away from it? And are there viable alternatives for those nations?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the two objectors who really threw a wrench in the works in the end were India and China. And while China is developing some of the most amazing green technology for energy, it is still burning more coal than any other nation except India. And so both coal mining and coal burning are key to their current economic structures. And so that was the anxiety point, that to say we were going to eliminate coal by a certain deadline, they were like, nope, we're not doing it. Now, there wasn't frankly a lot of conversation about it because it was such a last minute change. They agreed to language to draw down, but they did not agree to language to eliminate. And so that was really disappointing for a lot of countries. It was interesting. I attended a session actually with the WHO, was presenting there about climate related illness. And one of the speakers was speaking to air quality in India, and particularly the coal question. And we don't realize how deeply coal is rooted in the culture of India, but it's not only a source for creating energy in these huge plants that are, emitting a ton of stuff, but women cook on coal stoves in their homes, creating, their own emissions. It's a daily thing, and it is what people survive on. And so that conversation was really difficult, and it definitely, when Alex Sharma was tearful, that was the moment he was referring to. It was very clear to everyone that was the negotiation point that really tipped him over the edge.
And so I just wanted to sort of, were there conversations, or are there potential viable alternatives?
Yeah, coal is like, in that way, coal is like oil. There are ways for us to get around using coal, but how do you, again, this is a change that's going to have to be a cultural shift and a massive investment of funds in China and India to making those shifts. And at this time, they were not willing to make those shifts to eliminate. Draw down, yes, not eliminate. But again, they don't want to make, right now it's an investment question. Do we want to invest in transforming our economy from being one thing to the other? And we can ask ourselves the same thing about our cars, and we can ask ourselves the same thing about oil here. But coal was the big talking point this year at COP. And then this last minute negotiation strategy was really, it was considered really bad form, to say it in a British way, really bad form.
So we have another question about that sort of investment side. And that is that you had mentioned earlier that a large emphasis was placed on the financial side of COP. And I was wondering if you could speak to the disconnects that may have been in those negotiations between developed and developing worlds in terms of providing that financial support to ensure the developing nations will not be left behind, especially since they suffer the greatest consequences of climate change. If so, were there meaningful commitments made, or was that topic left at a standoff or a disagreement?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the negotiations, the ability to actually observe the negotiations in action were very limited because of COVID restrictions. So unlike previous COPs where you could have a horde of observers in rooms, they were limiting it. So I wasn't able to sit in on direct negotiations around finance, but I attended several panel discussions. And actually one of the most kind of cognitively dissonant moments of the COP was at a panel discussion around finance. And it was a panel discussion that had representatives from World Bank, the German government, and then the ambassador to the UN for Antigua Barbuda. And they were speaking on finance. And when I hear, panel discussion, I'm thinking discussion, right? Like they're gonna speak with each other at least. And the way it was structured was each panelist just presented their point of view. And so, first the government of Germany talked about all the money they have committed, which was great. That's awesome, good job. And then the ambassador spoke, and he made an incredibly passionate and direct plea for adaptation funding and for the loss and damage fund, which I mentioned in my presentation. And as he was speaking of this night that Barbuda died, and the fact that their GDP for a year was blown away, literally blown away in one 36-hour period. And he was doing so, was made even more dramatic by the fact that the ambassador is blind and was reading Braille, and he was throwing the pages after he was done. He was really impassioned. And the panel, and he made his speech. He went over time. They tried to cut him off. He wasn't having it. And then the moderator just said, "Thank you, ambassador," and now the World Bank. And it was just kind of like, what? Wait a minute, aren't you going to respond to this not only plea, but this kind of accusation of being ignored or of being, so that was really dissonant. And I thought, oh, Lord, this is not functioning in a way that's going to allow us to transform these systems that we need to transform. And so, as I mentioned, they did make additional commitments to the adaptation fund this year. So that is a positive. Still probably not enough based on the estimates from various agencies within the UN. The loss and damage fund was tabled, basically because developed nations did not want to open the door to liability issues around climate impacts, which I thought was really interesting. And so I'm happy to get into that more, but yeah, it was not a satisfying COP for the developing nations in terms of finance.
Thanks, Holly. One of the questions that's come in is from Jane, and Jane would love to hear what surprised you the most about COP. And I feel like you've shared some of the things that were surprising to you, but if there's something else that you could lift up.
I think I was incredibly struck both within and without COP, but actually within COP, I spoke about the art that was in Glasgow that was responding to this. there was a tremendous amount of art and creativity on display in both the blue zone and the green zone, which is this publicly accessible zone around issues of COP that is also available without an observer status. And the role of art as a mode of expression in this venue, I found very heartening, because I'm a humanities person originally. My dad's an artist. And so for me to see that and to see, young people's writing on the wall, I just thought that was really remarkable, how they were bridging maybe issue, if you have 197 signatories, you have a lot of languages in the room. To use art as that common mode of expression, I thought was really cool.
Great. We have a question from Caroline asking, did you get a chance to talk to any speakers after sessions, and what was the most impactful session for you? And I'll tag on to that because we happened to talk about it earlier. If you could take this moment to describe a little bit of what, kind of what you did with your time and what conversations you had. You mentioned these pavilions where I imagine an infinite number of side conversations were happening. So if you could talk a little bit about, like, when were you talking to people? What was that like? And then of course, don't lose track of the original question. Did you get to speak to speakers after sessions, and what was the most impactful session?
Excellent. Well, for one, hi, Caroline. She's a UNE student. She's great. Yes, so the pavilions, I'll describe those a little bit more. So within the blue zone, are the storied, plenary halls that have all the, COP26 stuff on it. And, it's where Biden spoke and all the heads of state speak, and where Elizabeth was speaking in the video. And then in this massive, what looks like an airline hangar attached to that building is the pavilions. And the pavilions are hosted by governments, they're hosted by NGOs, they're hosted by cooperatives, all these different groups that are working towards climate. And they're there to host speakers at some of these small pavilions. They could seat probably 15 people each in these little pavilions. They were there with demonstrations. And so I ran into my friend, my colleague, Daly Samba Dura. That was amazing to connect with her in that space. One of the best side conversations I had was actually with this young man who was introduced to me by my colleague, Glenn Page, who attended the COP with me. And he had met this young man who was working on a project in France, which was this incredible card game around climate action. And they've been using it. It's a scenario game where you use this pack of cards around climate impacts and how you track impacts of climate change. And he was amazing. And he's this young man. And we went to this corner behind the pavilions, like in this weird space that was no man's land. And we played the game. And he showed me how the game works. And it was really wonderful to have both that human connection after the sea of chaos around me, but to meet this young person who is so engaged, has a great idea. And actually, we're going to be convening at UNE North anyone who's interested to learn more about this project, because they would like to bring it to the United States. And it's free training, it's free materials, it's completely free, and it works with young people all the way up to adults. It was remarkable, simple, beautiful, and we just sat there playing the game. And it was just wonderful to connect with him and feel that inspiration from him. So he wasn't a speaker, he was a guy that I met through a guy, and it was really wonderful. So I can't wait to start that next project in the new year. Look for it, Caroline, you'll be in that training, I think.
That's awesome. I want in on that for
You got
sure.
it.
That sounds great. And what a cool thing that you had, that speaks to the in-person, right?
Yes.
Like being able to just bump into people or whatever, like have a side conversation.
Yeah, it really is. And to find that nugget in a sea of experience that we can bring back, right? That was one of, there were 3 things on my list when I came back saying, I need to talk to this researcher, I need to talk to card game guy, and one other, and those were the impact things I could do coming home. So that's when you find your nuggets, is when you're like in this weird area that's carpeted for no reason. It was just strange, but we were just back there playing cards and it was great.
That's awesome. That's great. So we have another question. This person asks, I believe the US promised funds for mitigation. As Maine is a forested state, can we benefit from those funds for carbon sequestration in our forests.
Interesting. I don't know, to be honest with you, I don't know the mechanism by which Maine would potentially access the US mitigation funds. So the way, this is one of the problems with the finance piece too, is what are the mechanisms for collecting and then distributing those funds, and how are they? And it's a deeply complicated system, which makes it very hard for developing nations in particular to access the funds they need. I think that's a really interesting question. I think, you know, Maine's role as a regional carbon sink is very interesting. We also have the potential around our coastline as carbon sinks, with marshes, with increasing our eelgrass. You know, there are a lot of options here for natural mitigation strategies here in Maine. So that's a great question. I'll definitely have to follow up on that one. But yeah, I mean, Maine has a tremendous amount of natural resources to be able to bring to this table.
And I guess part of the question that I missed relating to you is that the question also asked, is your sense that the funding is going to be available for mitigation and adaptation, or is it sort of all for all?
No, so there are two separate funds. There are two separate funds. So there's the adaptation fund, which is directed at addressing needs, particularly in developed nations, but other nations, to build infrastructure and other things to adapt to climate change. So if we're thinking here in Maine, right, we can think of sea level rise, we can think of erosion, particularly along the coastline. How are we going to, quickly adapt to those changes we're seeing that are having an impact on some of our infrastructure in our communities? So that's adaptation. Mitigation is really that technologies, and it's a small t, because it can be these natural, mechanisms that we can take advantage of. Those are also, frankly, an opportunity for Maine. When we think about that, we have the natural resources, but one of our natural resources, in my opinion, is a very windy Gulf of Maine, and how do we go about harnessing that resource in a way that is equitable, that is just, that takes into, consideration the people of the place, but also helps us kind of harness this tremendous resource we have to make the world a better place. So, yeah.
So we have a quick question, which is, what were the other two things other than the card game, the two impacts that you brought home?
The card game, definitely bringing that back. I did speak with a really cool research project in the Green Zone, actually, that was from University of Glasgow, and they are developing an app technology that is syncing with one of the major supermarkets in Scotland to provide carbon footprint information for your groceries and other products. So as you shop, you can see what the carbon footprint is of the orange that came to you from Florida, or you can see the carbon footprint of the jam that was made here in Maine. And so that you can make informed decisions about your shopping as you do this. And the app is kind of embedded. Imagine if you were to go to Hannaford to go and you start typing things in, and you could see your carbon footprint when you pull up paper towels. So you get to see that pricing. It's a tiny little pilot. It's one I'm very interested in seeing if we can become involved and perhaps start piloting it somehow here in Maine. So that's another one that I thought was really cool. And the third one is eluding me, Christine. I'm sorry, my brain is a little fuzzy right now, but there was a third. It's in my notebook over there. I could go look for it, but that would be distracting. So thank you.
So then we have a question that I was hoping to ask too, so I might editorialize as well, but I'll read Natalie's question first, which is, I have a question on your opinion of the COP structure. Greta Thunberg publicly criticized the template, calling it a, quote, greenwash festival, unquote, without substantial change commitments. Can you respond, having been there? And then I'm going to editorialize. Sure. About the way that protest around the festival or about the meeting, and in this case, Greta Thunberg was on the outside. You've seen Greta Thunberg on the stage of conferences and at the or at Davos and stuff. And at this moment, I assume would sort of still be welcome inside, maybe, has chosen to be outside. And I wondered if you could expand on what role you think protest plays, because it's more like, in a US political sense, it's like 1968 at the DNC in Chicago, where you've got, it's the Democratic convention being protested by leftists who are to the left of the Democratic Party, right? So you've got people with this at this event mostly protesting because they don't think COP is enough. So we're like, we want you to do this and then do more. It's very different from we want this whole thing to not happen.
Right.
As a kind of protest. So that's the unclear question I'm adding to Natalie's perfectly clear question.
So yeah, the role of protest I thought was fascinating because frankly, I'd never seen protests on that level because it was constant, absolutely constant. And it was varied, and it was tiny little groups and huge groups and massive protests, and it was this full range of different voices all saying the same thing. I mean, it was a unified voice saying this is not enough. To the question of whether COP itself is a flawed structure, which Greta Thunberg has raised on several occasions, I don't think she's necessarily that far off. I think the UN structure and the way it's structured may not be up to the task of taking care of such a complex issue as climate change. I think back to what Daly Sambadura said about thinking holistically, and the way that the UN has siloed conventions, climate change, poverty, different pieces of really what the indigenous people see as the same thing, right? And so the way that the COP is structured, again, I think of this idea of, well, we'll give voice to the indigenous people on their special day. That to me is a very kind of arcane way of trying to be inclusive, right? It's kind of, it's stuffy, it's old, and perhaps the COP itself needs a shakeup, or it needs to transform itself before it can transform other systems, right? And so the question is, do you try and transform COP, or do you come up with an alternative that stands outside of COP? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but having been there, I can definitely get Greta's frustration with that, and the fact that she didn't want to be in there. She would definitely, there's no way they would keep her out of COP. I mean, because that would be political suicide for the organizations of COP for her to be able to say, I was kicked out of COP. Like, you can't do that. But at the same time, she was making a really, really pointed statement, which is, I don't want to be associated with this. Pretty powerful stuff from an 18-year-old.
Yeah, thanks. And I think Natalie and I both got great answers to both parts of the question. So I don't feel so bad about hijacking.
I love what you just said about, do we transform COP, or do we create an alternative? And in my work here in Maine, I ask that question a lot because I see a lot of very active people, especially youth, on the climate justice front, the front line. And I see them and I hear them saying that exact same thing. Like, if these traditional organizations don't change, we're just going to start something else. We can totally do it, and we can totally overtake you. So it's funny. When
I showed the video of Elizabeth Watuti to the Portland Community Squash kids, I asked them their observations. I said, "What'd you see? What'd you hear?" And they said, "Oh, well, she was speaking to a bunch of old white dudes." That's what the kids saw. They saw the audience. When they pan the audience, Prince Charles is sitting right there, but they didn't know it was Prince Charles. They're just like, that's an old white man. And this young woman is speaking to this. It was a very interesting statement of power dynamics when you saw that. And the fact that the kids jumped on it, it was remarkable. From the mouths of babes.
Yeah, exactly. We have one last question from the attendees. So I'm going to read this one. Okay. Since the ocean can be one of our largest assets as a carbon sink, were there discussions on how to protect the ocean and combat the issues of water temperature rising, increasing acidity, and maintaining sustainable marine populations?
Yeah, the oceans definitely are a topic of conversation, both in this convention and other conventions within the UN. And so there are conventions on wildlife, there are conventions on biodiversity. I mean, there are a lot, again, to Daly's point, there are a lot of intersection between different conventions. And so what may not be prioritized at COP may be prioritized elsewhere. You hope that those conventions speak to each other, In terms of, yes, I mean, the ocean is one of our largest assets. And we are seeing, all we have to do is look in the Gulf of Maine. We are seeing the water temperatures rising. We're seeing we're seeing acidification. Our marine populations are evolving and changing. What we see in the Gulf of Maine is different than what we used to see in the Gulf of Maine. And I think we really, again, need to go back to how are we going to, yes, we need to think of the world's oceans, but what piece of the ocean are we responsible for? What pieces of the ocean can we take on? Because when we talk about oceans, my head spins. I mean, it is a massive idea to think, how are we going to protect the oceans, as opposed to what can we do to mitigate issues of climate impact in the Gulf of Maine. I don't know of technologies that can cool off oceans. I just don't. One of our kids at Portland Community Squash envisioned a giant ice cube in the Gulf of Maine, which was really cool. It was a really neat picture. It was this huge melting ice cube. And again, can we, in mitigating the climate change, then its impacts in the Gulf ideally will lessen. Okay. The fact of the matter is we've already seen one of the big problems around temperature change in the Gulf of Maine is we're seeing changes in ocean currents. You can't turn those around. So where the power of the Labrador current used to bring a lot more cold water into the Gulf of Maine, that is weakening. And the Gulf Stream is taking over and pulling more warm water into the Gulf of Maine. We can't necessarily reverse that. Can we stop it where it is and then adapt to that change that's in place? Perhaps, but it's a hard one.
Thank you for answering that very big question. And yeah, I know, and it does reflect sort of what's in the atmosphere, right? And what's going into the water that's ending up in the water, into the water on land, then ending up in the water. But we don't have any more questions from the attendees, but I have a question. I know, get ready. So I think that you've answered this question in a couple different ways, and it's something that I'm sort of processing, but I'm more now seeing how you said, it took you a while to sort of weed through, like, was it good? Was it bad? Did I learn? Did I not? Was it just a mess? Was it, all those kinds of things. And one of the things that I'm struggling with is sort of like that message from Elizabeth and these conversations you've had with other folks working on the ground with these different projects. Like, that feels like a movement. That feels like energy and change. And yet then we had, no, we don't want to cut down on coal. No, like, these are things that are actually flowing down. So like, when you think about the energy and the movement for positive change, is it possible to kind of measure that? Like, is there a sense that that's a wave? I don't know.
I think, this, in terms of the US, I think this has to become an issue that people vote on, because that's what decision makers listen to be honest with you. So those guys in the room who are making the decisions, not Elizabeth, not these other people who are involved in that movement and that groundswell, there's a disconnect there. They're not hearing the message. They're not listening to the message. And so they still fall back on the concerns that drive them, frankly, I believe, politically and economically. So they fall back to what is comfortable, having kind of sat there uncomfortably and listened to an Elizabeth or listened to the challenge from the ambassador from Antigua Barbuda. Like, they sit there, they take it, and then they go back to comfort and what they know. And I don't know if that is, I think some of it is structural to the COP and to how the UN functions. I think some of it is political power and how once you have it, you don't want to lose it. And so you are going to, so in terms of making real change at municipal level, state level, federal level in the US, it has to become an issue that we vote on. And more of those young people are coming online as voters in the US. And so that, I think, becomes a real piece of power. That's where a power dynamic, where that movement can collide with the policymakers and really, I think, make a difference.
Yeah, one of our speakers a couple of months ago was Kosi, and she's a high school student in Bangor. And she was part of a team of people who authored a bill. It's a climate education bill that will require climate education in school, in elementary, and training for teachers. And it's going to be coming up. And, you know, for all the people who are still on this call, like, pay attention and, you know, encourage your legislators to vote for that, because that's part of this. But yeah, I mean, to some extent, like, the kids know more than we do.
The kids are all right. They got it. I mean, I have these conversations with my niece all the time. This is an area of real focus for her and interest for her in her own studies. And she's fired up. You know, she dropped in her first week of school, she dropped Anthropocene and charismatic megafauna on me in a conversation. And I was like, whoa, now things getting crazy, but that's awesome stuff.
Well, and the shift not just to those younger people as voters, but to those younger people as elected leaders. And at this point, the fact that younger elected leaders, even in that room, you know, Jacinda Ardern aside, maybe, you know, I was just noting when Senator Bob Dole passed away this week that I was pretty young at the time he ran for president in 1996, but he was portrayed as so unbelievably old against Clinton, who was so young, right? And he was 73 when he ran for president. And right now, he would have been one of the younger people, you know, in the 2020 race. You know, or anyway, not the oldest by you know, several other people would have beat him, which is a separate issue. And I'm glad we had Kosi, you know, in this series to show that younger people really have everything they need to be those leaders or to be elected leaders, because that is, you know, an entrenched problem that it's incredible that, you know, Prince Charles, who's not elected to anything, but Joe Biden, you know, a lot of the leaders in that room were, you know, are not much older than Bob Dole was, last week. I mean, and, you know, and it's just, hopefully we'll see that shift, and they can bring some movement in this, you know,
and I don't want to say
that they see.
I don't want to say that there are no visionaries in the older age group, okay? Because Sir David Attenborough spoke right after Elizabeth Watuti, and I was crying. So, you know, he's one of my all-time heroes. But yeah, I don't want to overgeneralize it, but at the same time, the hope and the momentum that you're talking about, Jess, I think really is driven by youth. It's also driven by a lot of young women on this issue, which is fantastic. And it's driven a lot, frankly, the Indigenous voices were loud and clear at COP. And I think it's really important that those voices are heard. And that was the big lesson I came away with, is we have to find a way to extend the privilege that we have. If that means giving up some of our privilege, go for it. We need to elevate those who are not privileged enough to be in the room or have their voices heard.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so thank you so much. I'm glad we could end on kind of youth and the hope that we have for folks who are, you know, who are coming along with energy at any age, actually. So forget the youth part. People coming along with energy to make this change we need to keep living on the planet. That was the only one we have. Thank you so much, Holly, for you know, for going to COP and checking it out and coming back to tell us about it. Yeah, I mean, on behalf of the library, I would encourage folks to keep an eye on our site and on Southern Maine Conservation Collaboratives to see what we have coming for next year, which we hope to announce some stuff soon. We look forward to, I'm just gonna not even ask you, I'm just gonna say that we're gonna have that card game going on at various branches of Portland Public Library, whether Holly knows it or not.
Yeah. The library would be a great place to have that.
Exactly.
Yep. It is a 2022 collaboration. I see it coming along nicely.
So yeah, Holly, if you have any parting words for us, and of course, Jess, if you
I invite people to check out our work at UNE North on our website, which is une.edu/UNE-North. Google us, you'll find us. We are always extending ourselves to, work with folks in the community. So please let me know if you're interested in our work. And this has been great fun. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. It was really a great talk. I learned so much, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Thank
really
you.
Great to have y'all with us tonight. And thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, everybody. And everybody have a great evening.
Bye-bye.